Pull up. We're going to hit the water, were the last words Gary Hart remembered his friend Mike McCord yelling. The Cessna 182 they were passengers on slammed violently into the Tampa Bay at 170 miles an hour. The shell of a plane fragmented into a million pieces, but the damage to the aircraft was superficially inconsequential compared to the physical and emotional trauma suffered by the four passengers. Those four men, amidst broken bones, concussions, and the unforgiving tide of the Gulf of Mexico, now struggled to orient themselves and make some attempt to survive. When the chaos culminated and rescuers proliferated the crash site, only 3 of those men had made it to shore. One man never even made it out of the airplane seat. His body would be recovered the following morning. This man was on the precipice of becoming a living legend in the sport of professional wrestling, but his life was cut short at the age of 29 on that early February morning. This is his story. On August 25th, 1945, as the long Missouri summer was winding down, a king was born in St. Louis. Robert Schonenberger wasn't birthed into a royal bloodline. No, he was going to take his throne the old-fashioned way. Conquest was on his mind from a young age, and becoming the unquestioned king of professional wrestling would be his destiny. Sources close to the St. Louis territory at the time claimed that Robert would actively seek to train at gyms known to be populated with local wrestling talent. He wanted one thing: to become like them. One man who gave Robert a chance as a training dummy of sorts was 3-time NWA World's Champion and St. Louis wrestling mainstay, Wild Bill Longzon. After months of one-sided beatings, Robert still wouldn't relent. He wanted to be a wrestler. Longzon knew this undersized kid wasn't going to be denied, so he granted the young Schonenberger his wish. Robert's determination had now given him an apprenticeship under a former world's champion's watchful eye. His future was bright, but no one could have predicted just how impactful he would become in the evolution of wrestling. Robert Schonenberger would reinvent himself into Bobby Shane, making his in-ring debut in Portland, May 11th, 1964, at the ripe age of 19. Shane would face off against another notable wrestler from that era, Pampero Firpo, in his first recorded match. This wet behind the ears Bobby Shane wasn't yet the pro wrestling icon everybody remembers, but from all accounts the potential was always evident, and Shane's mind for the business was sharp even in his formative years. Shane spent 1964 and 65 traveling from Honolulu to Mexico City and everywhere in between, including frequent trips back to Missouri to work for Bob Geigel's Central States promotion. In Missouri, Shane quickly became a must-see attraction, and Geigel was quick to give the young wrestler plenty of wins around the loop. It wasn't long until other promoters in the NWA were taking notice of Shane's quick ascent up the ranks, and in July of 1966, Shane debuted in Jim Crockett's Mid-Atlantic promotion, and he continued to make a name for himself as a young and up-and-comer in the wrestling business. He'd stay with Crockett for about 6 months, but this youthful babyface Bobby Shane was still too green to be anything more than jerking the curtain for the Carolinas at this time. He'd leave JCP in early 1967 and spend that first half of the year working for the AWA. He'd even get an AWA World's title match against champion Vern Gagne on May 13th in Omaha, Nebraska. This Three Falls championship match ended in a draw, with both Bobby Shane and Vern Gagne scoring 1 fall apiece. In the second half of 1967, Bobby Shane headed north to Detroit. He would spend that time in big-time wrestling up until December of 67 when he headed south to Championship Wrestling from Florida, because who wouldn't choose Florida over Michigan in December? But Shane wasn't long for Florida, though. He was headed somewhere he wanted to go. He was headed back home to the St. Louis promotion run by legendary promoter Sam Muchnick, and Bobby Shane was on top of the world. He would have occasional dalliances in Central States territory with Bob Geigel while he was back in Missouri, but working for Sam Muchnick was obviously the pinnacle of the early career of Bobby Shane. In May of 1968, before heading to the Pacific Northwest Territory, Shane would team with Thor Hagen, doing the honors for NWA North American Tag Team Champions Bulldog Bob Brown and promoter of Central States and NWA Tag Champ Bob Geigel in front of a packed Kiel Auditorium for Sam Muchnick in St. Louis. While the young Bobby Shane was yet to break through to the main event star he'd become, he was clearly able to survive the meat grinder that was territory wrestling in the 1960s, and everything was looking up, and so it should have been for Bobby Shane headed into the second half of 1968. In his return to the Portland territory, Shane would rack up wins and would occasionally work the Northwest Promotions territory in Vancouver, British Columbia, a few hours north of Portland. It was across these two promotions in September and October, respectively, that Shane would twice challenge NWA World's Champion and Vancouver wrestling promoter Gene Kiniski. Bobby would wrestle Kiniski to a draw in Vancouver and Tacoma before closing out his time on the West Coast to end the year. Thank you for watching this little documentary that we've put together. If you're enjoying it, please think about subscribing to the channel, like the video, leave us a comment, and if you'd like to support us, you can head over to our comic book store, BigBeaverComics.com, over on Instagram at Big Beaver Comics, or right here on YouTube, Big Beaver Comics. Back to the video. Shane spent the first half of 1969 in Hawaii, working with the likes of King Curtis Iaukea, Professor Tanaka, and winning the NWA Hawaii Tag Team titles with an equally young baby-faced partner named Nick Bockwinkel in March of that year. Shane and Bockwinkel lost the belts a month later, but Shane persevered. Despite the grueling conditions of life in Hawaii, the young babyface kept his head high. Bobby Shane traveled back to the mainland and wrestled in Arizona, and then a couple of loops around the San Francisco territory to round out 1969. Traveling even more mainland, Shane would head back to the familiarity of home as he'd work the opening salvo of 1970 in the Central States promotion. Then he would debut in the Georgia territory as a masked competitor known as the Challenger in April of 1970. He'd soon remove the mask and return to the Bobby Shane gimmick, though, by June of that year. He'd team with the professional Doug Gilbert to win the NWA Georgia Tag Team title tournament that July, beating Buddy Colt and Homer Odell in the finals. Shane would defeat Nick Bockwinkel August 15th for the NWA Georgia TV title. This would make Shane a double champ for 13 days before the professional and Bobby Shane dropped the Georgia tag titles to the Assassins in Atlanta on the 28th of that month. Shane would drop the TV title 6 months later to Luke Graham at the end of 1970 as he left the Georgia territory and his days of being a babyface behind him. 1971 was the year Bobby Shane would see his career and respect around the pro wrestling business soar to new heights. He'd spend the year all over the NWA, including Georgia, Houston, and Florida. But it was in early 1971 in Gulf Coast where Shane would make his impact statement. Shane would enter the territory not as a babyface, as he was accustomed in his career up until that point, but as a pompous, cowardly heel. Shane would hit the ground running in the Gulf Coast territory, debuting in April and teaming with Terry Garvin, with a young 17-year-old Jimmy Garvin in their corner as their manager. They feuded with Cowboy Bob Kelly and his former rival, the Blue Yankee. On TV, Shane put the Yankee to sleep with his Cobra Clutch finisher he called the Japanese Sleeper. Shane ultimately refused to wake the Yankee up after the segment, and the Yankee began to convulse on live television until Ken Lucas ran from the back to make the save and aid in the Blue Yankees' resuscitation. This is what sold tickets to live shows in 1971 when you ran the same towns every week. Heels like Shane were hated so ferociously the people would pay every week to show up live on the chance they could catch a dastardly heel get the well-earned beating he deserved. Shane knew the fans would continue to pay to watch him at the top of the card, so he built this into his character. For the rest of his wrestling career, Shane would come on TV to do promos and claim the peasants at home needed to pay money to see him step foot in a wrestling ring. This was a great way to sell tickets to live shows in the 1970s. But it adds to the copious other factors that preclude wrestling fans like us today from having much available footage of Shane's in-ring career. On May 12th, for the first time, Shane came to the ring in Mobile wearing a crown and a cape and proclaiming to be the King of Wrestling. He lost that night to Mike Boyette, but the gimmick he created would echo through the annals of pro wrestling history to this very day. He would soon add his wife, Miss Sherry, as his valet. Sherry wouldn't get involved in matches like other heel managers. She was there more as arm candy and for Shane, so that he could remind the audience of how irresistible he was to women. Ultimately, when Shane would lose a prominent match to a babyface, he would blame Sherry for his shortcomings in the ring. Shane would finish 1971 in Florida, where he won the NWA Florida Southern Heavyweight title from George Geyser in Tampa. He'd go on to defend the belt against the who's who of wrestling in this era, including Hiro Matsuda, Johnny Walker, Bob Roop, Jerry Briscoe, and Bearcat Wright, amongst other men, before dropping the belt to Tim Woods in mid-March of 1972. In the early stages of a feud with Eddie Graham, Shane would break his leg on the 24th of June in Jacksonville's Coliseum in a no DQ match. Shane would begin managing other wrestlers, namely Redbeard, Doug Gilbert, and Mike Webster, all while swearing to break Eddie Graham's leg in revenge, even going so far as to bring a cast with Graham's name written on it into TV. Their feud would continue after Shane's return to active competition, but Shane would begin wearing a metal leg brace under his trunks to protect his perpetually injured leg. Shane and Graham would have one of Shane's most prolific and highly acclaimed feuds amongst fans and wrestling historians, fighting in many stipulated matches all over the Florida territory in the second half of 1972. Bobby Shane and partner Chris Markoff would defeat NWA Florida Tag Team Champions Jack and Jerry Briscoe in Miami Beach late in December 1972 for the belts. They would lose them less than a month later in mid-January to Big Bad John and Tim Woods. Shane would then find himself a new partner in Gorgeous George Jr. Shane and George would dethrone Tim Woods and Big Bad John on February 13th for those same NWA Florida Tag Team belts, but they would end up being transitional champions, losing them only a week later to Kevin Sullivan and Mike Graham. In late February of 1973, Bobby Shane would follow his friend and longtime rival, Jack Briscoe, north to the WWF for 2 feature matches in Philadelphia and Boston. While at the time, this may have seemed fairly casual, in retrospect, it speaks to the trust and respect a wrestler to the level of Jack Briscoe had for Bobby Shane to bring him to the New York territory and be his opponent in feature matches in major arenas. Shane was all over the Southeast in '73 as he'd become a main NWA attraction in multiple territories. He faced off against Jack Briscoe for the NWA World's Heavyweight title multiple times, as well as competing in Georgia, Gulf Coast, and Mid-Atlantic. The King of Wrestling was the hottest heel in the business. On September 24th, Shane lost a hair versus hair match with Johnny Weaver in Dorton Arena in Charlotte, North Carolina for the Mid-Atlantic promotion. Despite being hair impaired, Shane would defeat the legendary Dennis Stamp only a week later in Miami Beach for the Florida territory. And from all historical research available, Dennis Stamp was booked for this show, which we all know was the only way Dennis could have been expected to show up. It seems that Shane and Sherry's personal and professional careers were headed in different directions as they seemingly parted ways both on and off screen by 1973. Late in '73, while working in Georgia, he would cross paths with a young Jerry Lawler, who was currently polishing his craft away from the Memphis booking office. The young Lawler approached Shane about where he bought the costume for his King gimmick, as Lawler wanted to try something similar in Memphis when he'd return. Shane was leaving for an extended stay in Australia shortly and didn't work the Memphis territory, so he gave Lawler the gimmick, the crown, the cape. Somehow Bobby Shane managed to birth the 2 most famous King gimmicks in the history of the wrestling business. In early 1974, Bobby Shane left the United States to work for Jim Barnett's Australian wrestling promotion. The wrestling business was booming in the mid-'70s in Australia, and American talent were running tours of the Australian promotion much like they did in Japan. While in Australia, Shane worked as the assistant booker to Jim Barnett, a manager, as well as the occasional in-ring performance. At this point, it was clear the NWA hierarchy saw booking and promoting in the future of Bobby Shane, and they were giving him the opportunities needed to refine those skills. There was no one better to learn from than Jim Barnett. Despite a reduced in-ring schedule, he challenged Spiros Arion for the Australasian Championship and won the Aussie Tag titles with local wrestler George Barnes. In late 1974, after returning from Australia, Bobby Shane found himself conversing with Jerry Jarrett and would recommend bringing in a pair of Australian stars he'd just spent the past year working with. The names of Bill Dundee and George Barnes were given to Jerry Jarrett, who had significant influence in the Goulas Welsh booking office that ran the Memphis and Nashville territory. The territory was in flux, and soon the Australian team of Dundee and Barnes would take over the main event scene in the Ghoulish Welsh promotion, proving that Shane wasn't just a world-class talent himself, but that he could see potential in his contemporaries as well. After returning from a successful run in Australia helping Jim Barnett book the fledgling promotion, he was brought in by Florida promoter and longtime rival Eddie Graham to book the famed Florida territory starting in early 1975. Unfortunately, Bobby Shane would compete in his last match mere weeks after becoming the booker in Florida. On February 19th, Shane would tag with Buddy Colt to defeat Dominic DeNucci and Tony Parisi at Miami Beach Auditorium. Later that evening, Bobby Shane, Gary Hart, who was then known as Iron Mike McCord, later to become Austin Idol, and Shane's partner earlier that night, Buddy Colt, would board a single-engine Cessna plane headed for Tampa Bay. According to investigators, the four men left the Miami airport Wednesday evening, with Colt piloting the single-engine Cessna 182. Around 1:30 a.m., as a rainstorm swept through the Bay Area, the craft began approaching Knight Airport, dropping to 500 feet, banking to the left as Colt looked for the airstrip. Colt told officers that the airplane was traveling at about 100 miles an hour when it suddenly lost speed and dropped, landing in the bay some 300 yards offshore, southwest of runway number 3. The mangled plane quickly plunged to the bottom of the bay. Police said Colt, Hart, and McCord managed to free themselves from the cockpit and swam ashore. Police and U.S. Coast Guard personnel began searching the waters for the wreckage and for Schonenberger, but were unable to locate the aircraft until about 2 hours after sunrise. It was then that the world would learn the fate of the great Bobby Shane. He never made it out of his seat in the aircraft. When the plane hit the water, he was knocked unconscious and drowned, still strapped to the same seat he occupied, headed for Tampa Bay and another electric wrestling crowd. In the aftermath of Shane's passing, the wrestling business lost a legend just entering the prime of his talent. Even more tragically, his ex-wife and valet, Miss Sherry, who was still emotionally distraught over their divorce, would take her own life, making this tragedy even more heartbreaking. Rest in peace to all the vibrant souls lost in this story. After Shane's passing, he would be posthumously acknowledged by a bevy of his peers, including the likes of Jack Briscoe, Nick Bockwinkel, Jerry the King Lawler, Les Thatcher, Eddie Graham, Jerry Jarrett, and Sam Muchnick, to name but a few. We thank you for joining Carney, and we hope you've enjoyed our look at the life and legacy of the great Bobby Shane.